It's your man Akil again. I am delving into a very hot button controversy, namely the Republicans, or at least many Republicans, plan to try to defund Planned Parenthood. So obviously this one's fraught with some very intense emotions on both sides, but I figured if I was going to tackle an issue like this, I would try and talk to a friend of mine who I know for having a very cerebral approach to the issue. Although he has strong convictions on it, I also respect him for thinking his way through the issue instead of just feeling his way through it like so many people do, regrettably. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and former law school mate, Tavish Kelly. Tavish?
Hey, Akil, great to be on. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. And of course, thanks for joining me. Now, Tavish, why don't we just start with you summarizing your own background, what you do for a living, your credentials, that sort of thing.
My background's a little complicated. Like I said, we met in law school. I'm currently a grad student in mathematics at the University of Southern Mississippi. I'm the state chair of Mississippi for Young Americans for Liberty, and I'm also a gun store owner. I wear a few different hats at the moment.
Okay, so how would you describe your overall political ideology?
I'm definitely a libertarian. I tend to associate with the Republican Party, however, as a matter of practicality, largely being located here in Mississippi. You don't get much done outside of the Republican Party. I firmly believe in the abolishment of the state. And until that time, just take such means as to reduce the size of government and its role in our lives.
So would anarcho-capitalist be an accurate term to apply to your worldview?
I am an anarcho-capitalist. I consider myself a pragmatic anarcho-capitalist. I'm okay with taking gradual reforms to reach that position.
And on the abortion issue in particular, you are?
I am pro-life.
Pro-life. And so that's pro-life, sort of root, stem, and branch, including all the way to bans on abortion in the criminal law, as long as the state still exists, if I understand you correctly?
I think that abortion is a criminal act. I don't think that we should be throwing mothers in jail if they do happen to kill their children in the womb. That's based on my theories of criminal punishment. It's not really related to abortion itself. I don't really think that mothers who abort their children are a danger to anybody else. And so there's no point in putting them in a cage.
Interesting. So really quickly, before we get to the issue of Planned Parenthood,
Sure.
I guess it's fair to conclude that you don't believe in retributive justice then?
No, I don't. I believe that criminal justice serves the purpose only of defending society from dangerous people.
All right. I think that actually does clear it up somewhat. So when it comes to defunding Planned Parenthood, your position is that you support defunding it, right?
Absolutely. 100%.
Sum up your case for doing so in a nutshell.
I don't really think it requires much of a strong case coming from a libertarian perspective. One, all private organizations should be defunded in the sense that they shouldn't receive tax dollars, because obviously I don't believe that taxation is a just mechanism for providing funding to anything. So I think that Planned Parenthood, when it receives funds, should receive them exclusively from private parties. However, with Planned Parenthood compared to, let's say the ACLU is receiving money from the government through some sort of grant, I would find that more acceptable than Planned Parenthood, because Planned Parenthood has the additional aspect of performing abortions and receiving material assistance from the government while engaging in such behavior is unacceptable, in my opinion.
What do you make of the whole argument that it makes no sense to try to defund Planned Parenthood, even from a pro-life perspective, simply because, thanks mainly to the Hyde Amendment, it's already against the law for federal funds to be spent on abortions?
It doesn't really fly. The Hyde Amendment does prohibit federal funds to be used to pay for abortions. What it actually says is federal funds may not be placed in the same trust fund as any funds used to pay for abortions, and abortions may not be paid for from that trust fund at any future point in time. So what happens is Planned Parenthood sets up a couple bank accounts, and one bank account is for all their government monies that they receive, and the other bank accounts for all their private monies that they receive. And then they distribute the monies from those two bank accounts to their different operations. The issue with the Hyde Amendment is that after that point, it doesn't do anything. Basically, it says you got to have separate bank accounts. Normally, if Planned Parenthood has a certain amount of funding that they receive from private parties every year, let's say there's no government funding, that funding is going to be distributed according to some order of priority between their preventative services and their abortion services. Now, when they're receiving government money, the distribution of those private funds changes in light of government funds. Because the government funds can only go to the preventative services portion of their programs, more private funds than would otherwise be allocated to abortion are. So in essence, government funding does allow for increased funding for abortions, even though it's not specifically those government dollars. And that's the principle of fungibility.
Fungibility meaning what again?
Fungibility being an accounting or economics term. When you're dealing with homogeneous goods, it means that there's no difference between $1 and another dollar. So $1 going in is the same as a dollar coming out, even if it's not that same physical dollar. Each dollar has the exact same value. So you can shuffle them around as you like.
And so because of that principle, or rather that phenomenon of fungibility, federal funding to an organization like Planned Parenthood necessarily aids and abets the provision of abortion indirectly, if not directly?
It results in more funding for abortion.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the funding that abortion gets comes from private sources, but it only comes from those sources because of the federal dollars going to preventative services.
You already know this from that Facebook argument that you got into a few days ago, which is what gave me the idea for this interview. You already know I'm not a supporter of defunding Planned Parenthood.
Right.
Personally, I think that the segregation of federal and private funds, that's enough for me. I mean, I'm opposed to banning abortion anyway. About 10 years ago or so, when I was in college and going through a brief flirtation with conservatism, if you want the truth, although that didn't last that long, I considered myself pro-life. At no time have I ever been willing to go so far as to support legal bans on abortion, simply because I feel like that would backfire in much the same way that alcohol prohibition largely backfired, or that I think drug prohibition backfires today, even if it's something that is inherently so morally wrong that it warrants criminal punishment. There are enough people out there who want it badly enough that they're willing to pay for it and even risk getting into trouble with the law in order to get it. There's always going to be someone who will find a way to provide it, only they'll provide it more dangerously than it would be provided if it were legal. I always felt that way, and I still feel that way today, but since then, I've also come around more to a narrowly pro-choice perspective. In the past, I weighed the mother's liberty and autonomy interest against the interest in protecting fetal life. In the past, when I tried to balance those scales, I came out more on the side of protecting fetal life. But nowadays, as I've become more familiar with the challenges that women face, the burden and the trauma that pregnancy and childbirth represent, et cetera, and weighed them against, the fact that in the early stages of the pregnancy where most abortions take place, the fetus doesn't have self-awareness, consciousness, the ability to feel pain, et cetera, I've come around to the view that the woman's ability to control her own body and her own destiny outweigh the interest in protecting fetal life. I still view abortion as a tragedy. Unlike a lot of politicians who pay lip service to the idea that abortion should be kept safe, legal, and rare, I actually mean the rare part. I'd like to minimize the abortion rate. At the same time, I'm not willing to support any coercive government policies or private policies in order to achieve that. That's where I come out on the issue. When it comes to Planned Parenthood, I agree that government funds shouldn't be used to provide abortions. I can see where you're coming from on the fungibility issue and how it probably does indirectly support the provision of abortions, but I don't know that that's really likely to make a huge difference. And I suppose my question for you would be, what do you make of all the other non-abortion services that Planned Parenthood provides, particularly when it comes to things like birth control and the role that those can play in preventing unwanted pregnancies in the first place? Don't you think that argument would suggest that defunding Planned Parenthood might do more harm than good and actually lead to more abortions taking place?
It might. I can't predict consequences to that degree. I don't have a problem with the preventative services. I don't. I can just say that flat out. I'm fine with birth control and condoms and whatever other services there. I'm not super familiar with everything that goes into Planned Parenthood services, but I don't have a problem with preventive services in principle. However, I do think that the abortion issue is one of such overwhelming moral significance that it can't be overlooked. To make it an analogy, if instead of abortions, Planned Parenthood were euthanizing children with mental retardation or some other mental disability, if they were just euthanizing these kids at the age of 5 or 6 years old, while also providing some sort of preventative services to screen people so that they didn't give birth to children with these mental disfigurations, I would find the screening to be fine. But because of how morally repugnant euthanasia is in terms of just culling people, I wouldn't support providing any money for their preventative services in that case. So I think when you see abortion as a form of murder, it sort of stacks the scales in favor of that. And there's really no argument you can use to say, well, we can still fund the other aspect of this organization, despite the fact that they're murdering people on the side.
What do you make of all the pro-choice arguments based on the question of whether the fetus is viable or whether it's self-conscious or self-aware or able to feel pain? Obviously, you don't think that those factors justify abortion, but why not?
Because I think that rights start at the point that you exist. And as an individual, as a human individual, you exist from the point of conception. Now, from the point of detectability, which is going to be around 6 weeks or so, well into the first trimester before you can usually detect a pregnancy. Depends on the pregnancy, obviously. By the time they can tell that a woman is pregnant, the individual exists. There's no getting around that. There's an individual human being, or maybe two sometimes, right? Twins, who exist within this woman. And they will continue to exist within the woman unless killed or some other disaster befalls them for the next 9 months, at which point they will exist externally from the woman. The fact that they exist doesn't change just because they're in the womb or outside of the womb. You're still a human being on both sides of the womb. And I don't think that rights start from some arbitrary point. They have to start from either when you exist and then when you cease to exist, meaning death, is when you lose your rights. Obviously, we can't draw a line somewhere in the middle. Otherwise, coma patients who were expected to only be in a coma for 9 months would lose their rights for those 9 months, right? Because essentially a fetus is in a coma for 9 months. And I definitely don't support killing temporary coma patients just because they no longer have mental faculties during that period.
But you know what the obvious distinction is between those analogs and abortion, right? Because it doesn't exist within the body of another person, you can forbid people to kill coma patients without restricting another person's ability to control his or her own body. So why do you think that factor doesn't save or rescue abortion?
Coma patients often have to be on artificial respirators and all other sorts of devices to keep them alive for the time period in which they're in a coma. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Can those devices be freely withdrawn once applied? I think it was Justice Cardozo that said the hand once extended in benefit cannot be withdrawn with impunity. Our general principle is with medical patients, you can't just stop helping them once you've started helping them. I acknowledge that it's an unfortunate situation, but it's an unavoidable situation is a better phrase. That pregnancy starts before we know it starts, but the hand is extended nonetheless, and I don't think it can be withdrawn with impunity.
So when it comes to the public policy implications of the whole issue, aside from what we already discussed concerning whether defunding Planned Parenthood might actually inadvertently lead to more abortions taking place, in general, what do you make of the pragmatic argument that banning abortion would be counterproductive and would lead to back alley abortions and so on?
I think that abortions should be dangerous and rare, just like assassinations and just like all other forms of murder. I don't believe in legalizing murder, even though it does happen despite current prohibitions on other forms of murder than abortion. Strangulation is quite illegal, and yet it still occurs, and it occurs in very dangerous ways now because it is illegal. If strangulation were legal, perhaps there would be clinical strangulation facilities where people could go to strangle their victims in some form or another, but I wouldn't support it. Just because a prohibition makes something dangerous, that alone is not an argument against prohibition. That in conjunction with the fact that the action being prohibited is victimless is an argument against prohibition. But merely the addition of danger to prohibiting an activity for a criminal, a violent activity, just making it more dangerous is not an argument not to prohibit it.
I think it is if the degree to which the activity would continue is such that it swallows whatever benefits might result from prohibiting it.
So let's take a look at property crime, right? A lot of states in the past had duty to flee laws, where in the case that you came into confrontation with a mugger or somebody invading your home, you were actually required to flee from the criminal rather than stand your ground and fight back. This made situations, in theory, less dangerous, correct? Basically by legalizing property crime to some degree. Obviously, after the fact, there could still be justice done. But during the commission of the crime, self-defense was illegal in many states. Now, there's only a couple states that still retain that policy. Most have replaced it with stand your ground policies. But I think we have to take a look at the fact that morally, we have the right to defend ourselves and to defend others from violent actions, whether or not the defense of those actions may indeed create a more dangerous situation than would otherwise exist.
Well, I don't know if that scenario is really analogous to what I'm talking about. I'm thinking more in terms of, okay, here you have a procedure for which there's a certain amount of demand in society and for which there's going to be a certain amount of demand no matter what the government does or does not do. In this particular case of abortion, it's in large part because of what pregnancy is and how it affects women physically and in terms of how it affects their lives in general, their futures, their self-image, and so on. for the government to crack down on it is probably simply going to, for the most part, especially nowadays in the post-Roe versus Wade era, when, frankly, a culture of abortion or abortion rights has taken root in the country, given that so many women in American society have come to believe that they have a fundamental moral and constitutional right to abortions, if somehow you were able to ban it, you're either just going to displace abortions, maybe to neighboring countries like my own native Canada where they're legal, or you're going to drive them underground into the hands of the criminal element, like you saw during alcohol prohibition 90 odd years ago, or drug prohibition to this day. The fetuses, for those abortions that are still performed successfully underground, not only are the fetuses killed, the mother's lives would be threatened, or their health at the very least would be threatened as well, because a lot of these abortions might take place under unhealthy, unsafe conditions. And in addition to that, when you have the abortion equivalent of bootleggers dominating the industry, there are other negative effects that can result as well, just from having professional criminals involved in performing abortions. So I think when you take all of those factors into account, I don't know how well the analogy holds up. But one direction which I wanted to take the conversation before we break is, how much thought have you given to those effects that pregnancy has on women that I mentioned earlier? And how much thought have you given to the reasons why women have abortions? Because there was a recent interview in which an Ohio Republican state representative, Jim Bushy, was interviewed about the bill that I think the Ohio legislature recently passed, banning abortions after the fetal heartbeat can be detected, if I remember correctly. And
yes,
he was asked, why do you think women have abortions? And he had to admit, I haven't really given any thought to why women would want to have abortions. No matter whether you're pro-life, pro-choice, or anywhere in between, to me, it's downright despicable for a lawmaker to be proposing legislation that would have certain effects on women's ability to control their bodies, regardless of whether you think that's justified or not, without even giving any thought to why women do this. So what role in your analysis does that consideration play, if any?
Well, I have actually looked at research and surveys of abortion recipients. The percentage of women who undergo abortions for medical reasons and that their life was threatened or the life of the fetus was in danger, one or the other, those were around, I think, total 5%. In the case of incest and rape, it was 1% or less. The rest of the cases were all matters of convenience or economic feasibility of raising a child, that sort of thing. Well over 90% of abortions are taken for what we would consider elective reasons rather than any sort of medical necessity or even incest or rape, although I don't think that abortion is justifiable in the case of incest or rape. But even if we do include those, you still have 90% that are basically done for economic convenience reasons. So those are children who are being killed because the mother doesn't think that she can afford to raise the child, or because it's not a convenient time for her to have a kid. You know, she just thinks she's too young, or she and her husband just don't want children or whatever. Maybe that is inconvenient. I don't have kids myself, and that's not an accident. But for around 95% of them to be basically people like me who basically a lot of them made a mistake, and now they realized that they're not ready to have a child, I don't think that's a good enough reason to kill the child.
Well, when it comes to those reasons of convenience, that actually is one of the main arguments that I used to make against abortion, like I said, a decade or so ago, when I was still a young, fresh-faced college kid with two fully functioning knees. Part of what changed my mind about it over the years was talking to more women, not even necessarily women who've had abortions, because I've never in my life asked a woman, have you ever had an abortion? And I think I've only had one or two female acquaintances of mine ever tell me that they've had abortions. But I did a lot of reading into the subject, a lot of testimonials from women who have come forward about their abortions. And I mean, there are some who sort of did it cavalierly, but there were vastly more. I think the data support this. A large percentage of women who have abortions are women who already have kids, at least one child, and who had the abortion for that reason, because money was tight and they were at very vulnerable positions, maybe in their career development, and to have another child would have jeopardized their ability to care adequately for the children they already had. And so taking those kinds of factors into account changed a lot of the way that I took the convenience issue into account. I do think the term convenience can inadvertently obscure a lot of aspects of the issue, aspects of women's reasons for having abortions. That
I agree that they can have very, very strong reasons. Poverty is not nothing. And having several children already, that's a significant economic burden. I don't deny that. The question, however, is whether or not those are adequate justifications for the action being taken. Let's say you have two kids and you lose your job and you're a single parent, and suddenly you have an income of zero. Let's set aside assistance from the government or whatever. Let's just say you have no money all of a sudden, right? Is that an adequate justification for killing one of your children? to reduce the number of children that you have to take care of? I don't think it is. And it doesn't matter if that child is in the womb or that child is in your lap. Your economic situation doesn't justify you to take the life of another human. It may be hard on you, and maybe you'll have to find somebody else to take care of the child for you. That's a perfectly acceptable means of both taking care of the child and dealing with the economic hardship. But killing the child is not.
So I guess just to sum up, when it comes to the issue of whether banning abortion would do more harm than good, even just from a pro-life perspective, hypothetically speaking, even if it could be shown to your satisfaction that banning abortion legally would definitely not save any fetal lives, probably the same number of abortions would still take place. Either they would just be displaced or driven underground. Even if that could be proven empirically to your satisfaction, you would still support legal bans on abortion just because of the moral dimensions of the issue?
I would. And I find those consequences disturbing and disappointing if those were to be the case.
So your position on the issue is purely principled, purely deontological?
It's purely based on morals and principles. Yeah.
Okay. Out of curiosity, have you always held this position on abortion, or has there been any change in your viewpoint at all over the course of your life?
I haven't always held the position so thoroughly. I've always been anti-abortion because I was raised in a Christian conservative household. My dad's Christian and Jewish, and my mother's Catholic. So I've always been against abortion, at least nominally. It wasn't until I became a libertarian that I realized why abortion was wrong, why I realized why theft and murder were wrong in the way that they are wrong. So yeah, my position hasn't changed at the surface, but some of the underlying justifications, I would say, morally have changed.
It's interesting you bring up your religious upbringing, because the case you've made here seems pretty secular. I mean, one could have religious reasons for opposing abortion in addition to everything you said this evening, but one could also be an atheist and still agree with the position that you've just outlined. So
absolutely.
Does religion continue to play any role in your position on the issue? I mean, I don't even know what your religious beliefs are now, so I guess you could tell us that as well.
I'm a Messianic Jew. So I'm basically a Christian who still follows the Jewish traditions.
Okay.
Or you can consider me, pardon?
So you're one of the Jews for Jesus then?
Basically, that's a specific organization, but yeah, I'm a Messianic Jew.
I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah. My religion plays a very, very strong role in my morality. However, I believe that in order to exist in a secular world, I need to find justifications for my morality outside of my religion. And I think that the libertarian principle of self-ownership and non-aggression reflect, the religious principle of, I guess you would call it the golden rule. In general, I don't find any contradictions between the two. So it's been very convenient for me in that respect. And maybe that's because I'm playing into my own biases. But it does seem like a rational perspective to say that everybody is the proper owner of himself and therefore has the right to be free from murder and theft and slavery and so forth.
Do you think that libertarians have to be pro-life in order to be consistent? Or do you think it's equally legitimate from an intellectual standpoint for libertarians to be pro-choice as it is for them to be pro-life?
I think that there's an ongoing debate about that. Within libertarian academia, even, there's an ongoing debate, obviously within the country, but within libertarians and within secular libertarian Rothbardians, really, there's a debate about whether or not Rothbardian principles result in a pro-life or a pro-choice position. Walter Block of the Mises Institute gets involved in that debate all the time with his position of evictionism, which says that unborn humans are people, but they can be aborted before the point of viability. And as technology makes it more viable to prematurely give birth to a human and then place him on some sort of life support, that has to be the moral choice rather than just aborting. So that's Walter's compromise position, I guess. It's really unfortunate that we have to frame it this way, but there's a conflict of rights between the mother and the child, and there shouldn't be, because in my opinion, and this is coming from my religious perspective and cultural perspective, in my opinion, it should always be considered a blessing to have a child. It should always be considered a blessing. But people don't always consider it that way. So we have a conflict of rights between the mother and the child, and how you resolve that conflict determines, in libertarian principle, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. I resolve it on the side of the child. Others resolve it on the side of the mother. I'm not sure that any arguments have been made on either side that are conclusive, including my own arguments that are conclusively sufficient in defending pro-life or pro-choice. But I hope that such an argument can eventually be made for the pro-life side.
So I guess to sum up, you're not necessarily sure whether pro-choice libertarians are or are not contradicting themselves.
Right, I'm not sure yet.
Okay.
It seems contradictory to me, but I can't prove it.
Well, I'll tell you, just for the audience's benefit, I sure as hell don't think there's any contradiction. And From the data that I've seen so far in,
Mhm.
I think, Reason Magazine, I think a majority of people who self-identify as libertarians in the United States, at least, most of them happen to be pro-choice, which is something I've pointed out to people in the past. The handful of politicians who are libertarian and known for it, or lean libertarian, happen to be pro-life. Your Justin Amash, your Ron and Rand Paul. And so a lot of my liberal friends who are aware of libertarians at all have this perception that libertarians in general are pro-life, and that's definitely not the case. And so just as an empirical matter, that's an issue I always try to clear up whenever possible.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, most libertarians are not as strictly deontological as I am either. Most libertarians are a mixture of principle and matters of consequence. Right. Yeah, like you. So I wouldn't say I'm a rare breed. I mean, there are a lot of Rothbardians. It's just that we're not the majority in terms of strict deontology.
Rothbardians are not the majority of libertarians. Folks, I want you to memorize that sentence and take it home with you and study it, because this will be on the exam. I'm tired of people thinking all libertarians are just hardcore ideologues. No offense.
I mean, that's the dream, right? But
yeah, your dream, not mine. Anyway, so yeah, I think that about sums up our conversation for today. I just like to say in closing that I know this is a very, very difficult issue and a very emotionally charged one for a lot of people. As I mentioned earlier, I've changed positions on the issue to some extent over the years myself, so I see the virtue in both sides. Unlike a lot of people, I don't demonize people on either side of this issue, although I'll take issue with certain aspects of their positions. For example, a lot of pro-choicers are fond of saying, we don't know when human life begins, or human life doesn't begin at conception, which I think is crap. I think the biological evidence actually supports the conclusion that human life begins at conception, not necessarily personhood, mind you.
Right, yeah, it's an argument. But
right. Personhood is socially constructed, and thus when it starts is debatable, but whether an organism is a member of the human species and alive, that's scientific. I actually think the scientific jury is in on that subject, if you look at the scientific literature honestly and objectively. When it comes to abortion itself, on a moral level, I think that abortion is one of those tragic necessities in life. The world is a very difficult, dangerous, unfair, messy place. There's more than one category of killing that is justified in my view. Just wars. I actually think that the death penalty is justified for the most heinous crimes after genuinely fair trials. And this will piss off a lot of pro-choicers, but I think abortion is somewhere in that general universe of killing that's tragic and regrettable, like any form of killing, but nonetheless necessary. That's just my take. Obviously, we can agree to disagree on that. But having agreed to disagree, I would like to thank you very much, Tavish, for having this conversation with me. And I look forward to discussing this and related issues with you, and a lot of other issues as well in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me on, Akil. I can't say that my conversations with all pro-choice people go this well, but this was definitely a treat. So I'm glad to have been on.
Same here. Peace out.